So, John, you became Work and Pension Secretary in 2005. Pensions was then the sort of main issue. The Pensions Commission had been established. Pensions were the main issue on your uh, agenda. Um, how did you see the reform of pensions kind of fitting into the sort of broader ideological framework or the ideas framework of New Labour? Can you say a little bit about that process?
Well, I came into the department in 2005, as you say, and I'd spent most of my time in politics doing other things. I'd been a minister in the health department for many years. As a backbencher, I'd been pursuing areas of interest in the Home Department, the Home Office, and Defence and other spaces. So it was new to me, some of the policy agenda. Pensions was one of the two or three top issues on my in tray. There were other equally challenging things we were trying to fix, not least where the welfare state was going and how we needed to rebalance that and get a fairer sense of rights and responsibilities in place there. Incapacity benefit reform was a huge issue for us. But undoubtedly, the work that Adair Turner of the Pensions Commission had done was right up there as a flagship area where we had to move the ball forward. You know, we'd got into a very bad place. You know, there was very few people saving in the workplace. The numbers were going down. In fact, most people had no pension at all. And those who were saving weren't saving enough. So it was a classic problem where, you can't sort of coast your way through that one. You know, that required some pretty big interventions. And Adair Turner, Jeannie Drake and John Hills really put together, I think, an amazingly robust report. And I think what made it much easier for us as ministers was here was a piece of work that had been done by three really eminent people in their field. It was largely consensual. It was based on a really strong analysis that I don't think to this day anyone's really been able to unpick. It identified a very obvious problem and identified some very simple solutions. It had all of the ingredients you look for as a minister. If you're trying to do something really quite complicated, big and heavy, they had all the ingredients in place for us as ministers. So what we needed to do was pick up that ball and run with it as hard as we could. And it was very challenging because when the Pensions Commission was set up, its remit was to look at occupational pensions. But I think rightly, very early on, all three of them came to the view, well, we can't fix that problem if we don't turn our attention to what's going on in the state pension, because the two things are very closely related. You have to provide an encouragement, a reason for people to save. If that's taken away from them, if that incentive is diminished because of what you're doing on the state pension side, you're back to square one. You know, you're going to be running uphill. You're never going to get to the top. So that's when the controversy within government sort of started to get a little tricky, because the Treasury had a particular view about what we should do on the state pension, how we should contain costs and so on, which was at odds with the direction that Adair Turner and the Pensions Commission wanted to take. For me, it seemed to be pretty obvious this was not a pick and choose menu for ministers. If we took some of the Pensions Commission reforms and decided not to go forward with others, we'd end up with a dog's breakfast. So it was one of those exercises, this was my view anyway, that the whole thing hung together. Take it apart, it fell apart. And fortunately, government was able to come to a common position on this. It was difficult, but we got there in the end. And I'm immensely sort of proud of the work that was done by the Pensions Commission. It made our job as ministers very easy. And, I always used to say to my team around me at the time, this will be very difficult to sell. People won't want to be sort of dragooned into pension schemes. They want to have their own money. They don't want to spend it. I always took the view, and I always said this to people, that, people are not daft. There's an obvious benefit to them, particularly in a workplace pension environment where the employer's paying in as well as you. This is a way to prepare for a life of prolonged retirement, where we've all got very high levels of expectation about our income levels. So people are not stupid, and I think the proof of the pudding was that look where we are 10 years on. It's a policy success, and there are a few of them in this field. Pensions has been bedeviled by various initiatives and reforms. We tried them, stakeholder pensions, so on. Largely fizzled out. This one has endured. It's captured the popular imagination, and I think it's going to be one of the most important reforms to the welfare state, our welfare society, that the Labour government did.
As you describe it, the critical issue was that there wasn't a pick-and-mix approach, that it hung together. But you had a series of stakeholders out there in the wider world, which you as Pensions and Work and Pension Secretary would have had to have dealt with. all of whom had both something to give and something to take out of that package. Can you just say something about that kind of process of getting consensus from those sort of actors, the TUC, the CBI, the pensions industry?
I think the way that the Pensions Commission set about their work was from the very beginning a drawing together of opinion, and they were very successful in doing that. They were very consensual in their approach. They were open and transparent. I think that's a critical lesson for anyone coming in to do a piece of work like this for government. You know, you can't lock yourself away in a room and come up with some ideas a year later. You've got to be out there working with opinion formers, opinion leaders, and they did that brilliantly. I mean, I couldn't fault them. I think there was something for everyone in this. I mean, certainly the trades unions, some of the NGOs didn't like the increase in the retirement age that was intrinsic to making all of these reforms, affordable in the medium to longer term. But I think most people approach this with an open mind. And I think when you compare, for example, how some of these debates have gone in the UK to how they've gone in other parts of our own immediate neighbourhood in Europe, it's very different. There's been very little resistance to the idea in principle that people should work longer or their state pension should be delayed. And that's in no mean measure down to the work that Adair did. I mean, we again were the beneficiaries of that. Obviously, it became our job at that point to take the ball up and run with it, but the groundwork had been done. I always looked at it as a common sense sort of solution to the problem. I mean, there had to be some way of balancing out, the money, and particularly if the state pension was going to be more generous, which it essentially became, that had to be, sellable to taxpayers too, and this was an obvious way of doing that. I think the overall report, though, got a massive thumbs up from all sections of opinion out there. There was no opposition to it. Our biggest anxiety as ministers, though, certainly mine, and this is the one I agonised about the most, was the compulsory employer contribution. Because this was not really what New Labour was really all about. But it was one of those things, if we didn't do it, the reforms would be ineffective. I think there's still a very significant issue, a debate to be had about the overall level of contributions into the new auto-enroll pension schemes. I don't think they're enough. I think there'll have to be some adjustment at some point in the future upwards. I don't think a 10% rounded up sort of contribution rate with the tax relief and the various contributions from employers and employees is going to be enough for a very important group of people paying into auto-enroll schemes, particularly those on above median earnings and so on. But I think this was the debate we agonised the most, and the person who helped me the most was none of my Labour cabinet colleagues. It was Philip Hammond, who was my Conservative shadow. And I have a very great deal of respect for him, because he came to me and he said, "John, we've looked at this. We will support you as the opposition if you go for the whole Turner package, because we think it's the right thing to do." And I wasn't afraid of having a row with the opposition. After all, if you're afraid of having a row with the opposition, you probably shouldn't be in government at all. But I didn't want this policy to be beset by party political divisions, because that's what has done for pension reform. Going back to Barbara Castle's time, everything was opposed. Everything was started for a few years and then stopped. A nightmare. So when Philip came to me and said, "We think this is the right thing to do, we won't oppose you if you go for the compulsory employer contribution," it was a complete game changer for me.
So the Conservative Party's support for, particularly on the employer's side, that they would be able to, as it were, at least help you deliver that commitment from employers.
Yes, they weren't going to oppose that. If they'd opposed it, it would have been harder for us, not impossible, but certainly would have made it much more party political. And I wanted these reforms to survive a change of government. There's no point doing pension reform if after 3 years there's not a lot coming and they start again. It's pointless to do it that way. The CBI were very supportive all along. The employers' groups were very supportive. I never got the sense that they were opposing the reforms, but they wanted a clear commitment that the contributions would stay at the level that Turner proposed. And of course, we legislated for that. We baked that into the primary legislation, so it required another act of Parliament to change those contribution levels. So that was the guarantee employers were looking for. But with that guarantee, and the opposition's support at the time, it was a sort of a ticket to ride. It was a means of getting this radical reform through with a minimum of political fuss. And I think, now it's not really regarded as a controversial reform at all. It's cross-party. It's great to have, everyone feels they own a bit of this policy. And that's what you need if you're going to build for the long term.
So it was the guarantees to employers and the incrementalism of not starting too high, not pushing too much, so getting the principles embraced that made it important.
Well, and that was Turner's recommendation. It wasn't the employers trying to change the structure of these reforms. This idea of taking it slowly, building up, getting everyone used to the idea of contributing, then moving up the contribution scale, I think was absolutely the right way to build that consensus with and support of employers, because they're the ones who have to essentially be in the room. They have to be able to support these reforms, and they did.
So let's just talk a little bit then about getting consensus in governments. You said earlier that the Turner Commission's analysis and its costings were very robust. Was that really important?
It was important. No one did challenge them. Treasury came up with some different proposals for the state pension, which would have, in my view, driven a coach and horses through the whole scheme. It would have depressed the value of the increase in the state pension. It would have raised a real doubt in many people's minds, particularly of those on low earnings. Well, there's no point me joining this scheme if I don't. I'm going to be, with the means testing and everything else, probably on a pari passu position. So there was an argument. I mean, it's well documented. Tony Blair had set up the Pensions Commission, and you'd expect he was naturally invested in it, and he was very strongly. I would not have been able to overcome the Treasury sort of objections to the state reform proposals in Turner's Commission if it had not been for the Prime Minister's support. A DWP Secretary can't overrule the Treasury. It's just not how the game is conducted. But with the Prime Minister's support, you can. But again, it was so what we did, we sort of made a concession about when we would start this indexation linking. And of course, the triple lockers moved it on a little bit further as well. But I think we delayed the start of the indexation to income as a concession to the Treasury. I don't think it clearly wasn't a fatal sort of adjustment. The Pensions Commission would have liked us to have started much earlier. They were looking at 2008, as a kickoff. And the delay will have had some impact, for sure. But I think a modest one on the overall architecture of the reforms.
So that particular compromise unlocked the whole package effectively.
Then that was it. And then, of course, everyone claimed ownership of it at that point.
Yes, indeed.
It was everyone's baby.
And you published a white paper rather than it being announced at a budget. I mean, it was a package that was embodied in a white paper in the summer of 2006.
That's right, yes. Yes, that was interesting too, because at that time, most of the welfare reform proposals were in budgets, because the Chancellor then had a very strong sort of interest in welfare reform, which is fine. I have absolutely no problem with that at all. Welfare reform needs the support of the Chancellor. Again, it's how our system works. But this was probably the first major reform that the department itself felt that it was doing. And from my point of view as a Secretary of State, it sort of put quite a lot of lead in the pencil of the department. They felt very positive about being in the lead, taking initiative and running it.
Going back to this question of commissions and public consensus, I mean, the other area of reform of the welfare state for older people, social care, is a complete contrast to pensions reform. I mean, almost diametrically contrasted.
I think the social care analogy is a very important one, because I don't think there is a silver bullet. There is no magic way to make social policy. Previous attempts to really fashion a set of reforms that can command support have failed. I don't think that's a failure of the process. I think what Andrew Dilnot did was incredibly important. I think it was a failure of political courage and leadership at that point, because there was a perfectly sensible policy which I think might not have solved every nook and cranny of the problem. It's a huge one, actually. It would have definitely got us moving in the right direction. And it was a well-crafted sort of set of reforms that would have involved the insurance market and the private sector stepping up and working with the welfare state to take some of nightmarish risk off the table for a lot of older people going into that stage of their lives. But it failed not because of process, but because of politics. I think with the Pensions Commission, the process was absolutely robust. And I think the political winds were behind it too. Government, opposition. I think it was a sort of perfect sort of combination. I think most people recognized we had to solve this problem. And no one produced a better analysis of the problem or a solution to it than the Pensions Commission itself. So I think politics likes solutions. Even opposition and government together, they like to get a problem solved if they can. And I think the social care thing is different for that reason.
Yeah. Can I just ask a little bit more about the auto enrolment? This is probably the first big example of the use of behavioural economics in public policy. Were you conscious that here was a sort of evidence base that was new, apparently very robust, that was underpinning something which hadn't really been done before at scale, certainly?
I was very aware of it. I was attracted to it because it actually gave personal responsibility. It's established that at the right place, which was with the individual, not with the state or with anyone else. People had to make, actually, although it was perhaps a less overt choice, it was nonetheless their choice to be in. And I think that's very important in a modern democracy. I think that time has come and gone, where solutions can be mandated or imposed. You've got to have people involved in them, especially when it's their money. They can choose to spend the money. It is their money. I think it's important to understand that. This is occupational pension saving. It's not sort of national insurance or state-based systems. We were very aware of that. We were excited by it. We weren't sure it was going to work, because a lot of people out there were saying it's not going to work. It's worth trying, but it probably won't work. Opt-out rates might be 30%. I think I saw some figures suggesting if they were at that sort of level, we could still regard it as a success. As we know, opt-outs were much, much less than that. So I think it certainly sort of gave birth to this huge interest across government in behavioural sort of economics, and we've seen it work in the Justice Department and various other areas in a stunning way.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose I'm coming to your point about personal responsibility there. Is that solution to these reforms kind of consistent, if you like, with the basics of Britain's political economy? That these reforms work in part because they go along the kind of path dependency.
I think that's true. That's largely true. I think, however, government's got to be prepared for an alternative if the current course fails. If we do see opt-out rates increase significantly with income contributions rising, if that happens, I, for one, don't think we can just shrug our shoulders and say, well, there we are. If 50% of people opt out, well, we have to live with that. We can't live with that, because that is going to haunt us as a society when those people get to retirement age and are poor. We can't have that. So the idea that, well, we tried and failed, there is no other alternative, we might have to go down the route of compulsion. We might have to. So I saw this very much as let's avoid that route if we can, because it's the ugliest, most brutal route to go down. It doesn't really build consensus, it imposes a solution. But if the attempt at sort of gentle persuasion through auto-enrolment fails, then I think government will have to look at alternatives, yes.
In the more recent reforms to pension flexibilities and so on, in some of the interviews we've done, they've said, well, actually this is difficult because,
Sure.
Effectively these reforms embedded a social contract. They said
Sure.
the state will do these things if you do these things.
Sure.
So what you're suggesting appears to be that, there is a balance here, and if we go down a path of reforms which liberalises too much, and we find that people end up in poverty as a consequence, that the state will have to take a more active role again.
I believe that to be true. And I am concerned about some of the implications of the more recent changes, particularly around personal choice and freedom, about what you do with your pension pot when you get to 55. I quite understand why government got to the point where it felt that it couldn't compel people to purchase annuities because they were such poor value for money in an era of low interest rates. It didn't represent a good solution, a good outcome. So I quite understand that. But I think my concern is, why 55? My concern is, well, what are you going to rely on as your pension income if you cash in your pot and spend it? I don't think that framework was was robust enough, because all routes lead back to the taxpayer at the end. And I am concerned about unsustainable additional costs on the welfare budget if people's pension savings have been consumed long before they even give up work. I mean, that would be a terrible outcome, actually, and undermine the whole principle of saving for retirement. So I think the government have come in with a very blunt instrument indeed. I do respect the argument about personal choice. And I have no problem if you've got a good DB scheme as your sort of default, and you've perhaps built up, as many would do now, small pots of DC that in the current environment are not likely to give you an adequate retirement income. It does make economic sense. It's perfectly rational to be able to draw down that money and pay off your debt or support your kids buying their own home or whatever it might be that you want to do. That I have no problem with. But I think anything that fundamentally torpedoes below the waterline the principle of personal responsibility for building up a pension for your retirement when you are able to do so, that's you cross that line, you're in real trouble, I think. And I think I would share the concern of many that have been expressed that these reforms potentially could begin to unpick some of the good work that has been done to date.
Well, the settlement might become unstitched. Yes, yeah.
If people begin to think of their retirement savings as actually not about retirement at all, something we can just spend now.
Just one final thing. Where would you rank pensions reform, thinking about other successes and failures?
I would put it pretty high up the list of successes. And I do that for a number of reasons. The evidence to date about how the policy has worked, its durability, therefore, and its consensual nature. It's a big reform. It's a huge reform, and on anyone's radar, this is going to register. I would probably put it amongst the top three things that the Labour government did. The minimum wage was very important, I think. I think some of the economic reforms that we introduced at that point, hugely significant. But I would put it right up there at the very top, in the top three, yeah.
You were creating, first with PADA and then Nest, a whole new delivery architecture, which is quite a big thing to do. Can you just say a little bit about that? Because obviously you were doing that at the beginning.
Well, this was something very much that was an issue that the department had thought about. This was very much our sort of contribution, if you like, to the whole package, because Turner had created the architecture, the basic sort of policy pillars. We had to do the delivery implementation piece. That was very much our responsibility. And I think there was a sort of rule book to follow. We took a lot of advice about this. We went out and talked to people about the best way to do it. We wanted to do it carefully. We didn't want to, make this the Achilles heel of the whole reform package. It could easily have become a monumentally complicated bit of operational sort of policy. I was wrestling at the same time as we were doing this with the child maintenance fiasco. Perfectly sensible idea, had become completely unoperational. It couldn't be delivered. The system was riddled with inconsistencies, and I don't just mean technical problems, I mean policy problems in implementing. I defy anyone to find a system whereby you can compel people who don't want to contribute or feel that when they do contribute, the money gets clawed back by the taxpayer and their kids don't benefit. I defy anyone to design a system that's going to make that work. It just wasn't going to work. So that was really kind of haunting us too. You could see how a perfectly good idea would just disintegrate if you didn't get the right operational framework for it.
And you felt you had really good, technical advice and
great technical advice. This was actually when the final advice came to ministers. I don't think there was any concern expressed across government at all about this aspect of the policy. I mean, we went out to the city, we went out to the pensions industry, we took a lot of advice. We brought onto that body some really significant leading figures from the industry like Paul Miners and others. And I don't think when the history is written about this reform, anyone's going to focus on this part of it.